Hi, and welcome to episode 45 of the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience, and taking us on a journey this week is Andreas Wickhoff. Andreas is an Austrian master of wine and general manager of Willi Bründlmayer, a leading light of the country's Kamptal wine region. Apart from anything else, Andreas is an articulate authority on all things Austrian, so there's plenty of insight to be gleaned on its traditions, trajectory, regions, and special sites. There are also some details that may be easier to latch onto if you see the region, village and vineyard names written down, and you'll find all that detail as always in the extensive show notes as well as maps and photos in the accompanying Substack article. In addition to Andreas' past life as a would-be 5-star hotel manager, we spoke about the challenges and opportunities involved in farming 90 hectares to produce a truly world-class range of white, red and sparkling wines at this certified organic estate. I started by asking Andreas to pinpoint his current location.
At the moment, I'm in Langenlois, Kamptal, about 1 hour northwest of Vienna. I just came from the vineyard. It's looking to be a very hot day. Actually, tomorrow or the day after will be one of the hottest days on record thus far, apparently. But the vineyards still look good. They are in good shape. We are post-flowering. And here I am, back in the rather cooler environment of our cellar here.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Andreas and I are talking in the middle of one of the biggest heat waves in recent memory across Europe at a time when both Austria and England are still in the World Cup for now. Touch wood, that doesn't change in the near future. We'll go back now from Langenlois and today to the past. Whereabouts are you from? Because you're not originally from the Kamptal.
I am not originally from the Kamptal. I'm a bit of a wild mix per se. Well, my parents are both from Austria. They are from a province called Steiermark, Styria, which is bordering Slovenia in the south of Austria. I was actually born in Bavaria, in Germany, close to Munich, in a town hosting the oldest brewery in the world. So I do like beer, but it took me the other route. But I grew up and I consider myself a Styrian. So from Steiermark, close to Graz, the second largest city of Austria.
Cool. Well, I want to talk about Steiermark later on, but before we do, we'll stick with you as a young Andreas. What was your upbringing like, and what kind of child were you? What were your interests?
My interests were manifold, but especially sports I did love a lot. So I did a lot of different sports activities, from football onwards to tennis to beach volleyball. That actually took me then in my study times in Australia also to do it almost semi-professionally there while studying in Australia. And I did have a sincere interest also of traveling. So my parents took me to different places. My mom is a really good cook, and we had a rather good garden. And I was brought up by, I think, a lot of good flavors from Steiermark. It's not only wine that grows there, but many different fruits and vegetables. I was really very lucky to have been in a very safe and cozy environment during my childhood, having a lot of friends and generally a really good time.
And I know you as being a very studious seeming and very informed character. I'd imagine that you were pretty good at school as well as being sporty.
I definitely had my teenage years. So during my teens, I was probably not high up the ladder in terms of being best in class. But just after graduating from high school, I then went to a college for tourism and hotel management. And yeah, I really loved all of the tuition that took place there. And that resulted also in quite good marks.
What was it about the hotel industry that drew you in the first place?
Honestly, my first plan, the original plan, apart from my dream job being a professional football player, was basically running a 5-star property hotel in one of the greatest places in the world. That was my plan, to be general manager of a 5-star hotel somewhere in the world. And that's why I took the College of Hotel and Tourism Management. And it actually, the idea grew further, but then the wine bug hit me fairly early, say in the late teens, so around 18, 19. That's where I was influenced by both my brother and one of my best friends. And that's where the wine journey then started to become more active, as opposed to trying to run a 5-star hotel in the future.
Okay, so were your brother and friend interested in it because they grew up in a wine region, or were they in a profession already?
So my brother is a bit older than I am. He's 11 years older. And I always looked up to him and because I saw him working in some of the great places, both in Austria, but also abroad in Ireland. He was on a fine cruise ship. And he actually brought, for the first time, foreign wines into our house. So that was one part. And from my friend, he is a bit older and he already had a little bit of work done in the restaurant scene in Vienna. And they are amazed by the world of wine, not only from Austria, but from abroad. So we started, tasting 93 Montebello at the age of 19. And that grew my interest for all different sorts of wines. And my brother brought the book from Jancis Robinson, Wine Course, in German at that time into our house. And I saw what she did. And then I asked myself, oh, that sounds really interesting, what she has done there. And maybe one day I can also follow that route.
Yeah, right. What was it that grabbed you about it all? Because you're already in a sort of hospitality zone, but also in a tourism zone. So I guess that gets you thinking about other places. And I think you mentioned that your mother was a great cook. So was it all of those elements or was it one particular thing? I mean, was it the wine for the wine or the wine for the places?
Cool. I think more almost a wine for the places. I think I was nurtured in a way that was very nature driven and where, organic certification, so forth was nothing important because it was just there. Like my mom had her own garden and of course we also bought fruit from elsewhere, but very often from a local butcher or farmers that were around. So it was clear that this was organically grown and that was one thing. And then the other thing with the hotel industry comes obviously a food and beverage environment, very often related to this because that's what you find also in hotels. And so this grew further into the food and beverage scene and then even more in detail than into the world of wine because I thought it was so intriguing and interesting to see the different cultural components in farming vineyards and the history behind wine and the diversity that it then saw. Of course, we were brought up by simple Welsh Riesling from Steiermark and maybe a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc then and some Chardonnay. But then we also, of course, saw, the Northern Italian reds. We explored for the first time when I was like 18, the New World wave coming in from New Zealand, from Australia, from Chile. Very approachable, but also very outspoken wines. And that really raised my interest for wine, why these wines were tasting so differently. I wanted to know why. So I tried to pursue that route a little bit further.
Yeah, right. You mentioned you studied in Australia and were playing semi-professional beach volleyball here, which I didn't know, and I think it's very cool. And I assume you've got the sport on your mind and probably as a young man, other things when you're out on the beach playing sport in Australia as a foreigner. But was wine on your radar when you came here? Did you taste some stuff then?
Absolutely. Well, wine was on the radar and I continued in Australia studying hospitality management and that included also wine tuition. I first explored at the age of 19, Hunter Valley Semillon and, obviously reds from Australia. We tasted already in Austria, but I also went to the Hunter Valley and then also down to Melbourne at the time, but I was studying in Brisbane. And before I actually started studying there, I already registered at a beach volleyball club in Brisbane. Before I was already traveling down there because it was very important for me to continue with beach volleyball. So that was really a cool time.
Yeah, and so you were already traveling. It wasn't the first time, obviously, you'd been overseas. Apart from anything else, you were born in Bavaria. But where else had you been and where else made up your formative memories of traveling and experiencing other cultures in situ?
Well, I actually have to say that I had an internship in 1996 in Barbados for about 3.5 months. And I was working there in a hotel, which was great as well. Lots of work. I can tell you in the 3.5 months, really, I did not have one full day off. So everyone thinks like, oh, Caribbean and great. But I had a really good boss. I'm still in contact with him, but it was a lot of work. But then my first even longer overseas period was in actually Australia because life seemed almost too easy for me at home in a way that, I was well taken care of. So I needed to make sure I want to be independent and I need to grow up both from professional level, but also from a private point of view. And so I said to myself, I want to go as far away as possible, pretty much. So Australia it was. And then after Australia, I came back just very briefly to Austria. And then it took me to the US for the first time. And that was in 1999 or 2000. I went to Princeton, New Jersey. And still having in mind, I want to become a general manager for a hotel. So I worked for Hyatt Hotels and had a management training program there. It was great, but also kind of hard. It was sort of the first time when I felt a little bit homesick, I have to say.
So when did wine start becoming more part of your professional duties?
I think then actually in Princeton, when I was there, I did not have so many friends that were there that were interested in wine. But I saw in the nice restaurants around Princeton, but then also, we went to the city, to New York rather frequently. And I saw for the first time in the top restaurants that also Austrian wine was going to be featured there for the first time from, well-reputed estates like the one I'm happy to work with at the moment. And then from the Wachau, etc. And so there, my interest continued in wine from a US point of view. Like, the selection in the US was then really very big, very vast already. We had a lot of wines from France, from Italy, from the US, obviously. And that broadened my horizon for North American wine. And so I got a bit more interested then even further. I was subscribing to the Wine Spectator at this time, where very differently from today, a one full page in every issue of a Wine Spectator was dedicated to the health benefits of wine consumption. Today, we're in a different ballgame there. But this really grew my interest for wines from the Americas. And then obviously Wine Spectator, however, also featured, wines from all over the places. And having spent then a year and a half in Princeton in the US, I wanted to make sure not to lose my school French. So then I decided I need to go to France and see a little bit the country there, and especially not losing the language. So I went to France then right after Princeton.
Whereabouts in France?
So then I went again, sports affiliated decision. I went to the Trois Vallées. I went to Courchevel because I really love snowboarding and skiing. So I spent half a year in Courchevel, working for a really top hotel, a 5-star hotel, again in the restaurant trade. And then after the winter season there, I went to Corsica. And in Corsica, we got to learn the wines from Corsica. And throughout the entire year, throughout this full year in France, all I had and learned was French wine. And from, also lesser known regions like, Cîteaux, Montbazillac, from Cahors, from the south of France, obviously, Bandol, and so forth, apart from the classics. So that really gave me a good insight of what France is about and why the French are so proud of their country. If I were French, I think I would also be very proud of that country.
Has that informed your shaping of Austrian wine culture, do you think?
Actually, it probably shaped the overall style and preference of wine that I have. Maybe having a bit more restrained elements in wines, more salty elements, more finesse. I think this was definitely a big learning curve for me in terms of profiling the palate in a way.
Yeah, okay. So when did you settle back down in Austria then, after all this globe-trotting?
So after Corsica, I went back for half a year. My brother-in-law is running one of the largest hotel companies in Austria. And he asked me to be there in the marketing department. And I said, yeah, because having worked in France and Corsica, this was really a lot of hours. I was also responsible for the cheese cellar. We were 2 sommeliers for 140 covers a night. So we were running quite well. But again, I learned so much there. But then I needed, I think, a little bit of a break, maybe less working hours. So I took that choice of the offer from my brother-in-law, but realized rather quickly, say after 5-6 months, that this was not for me. And so it took me back again to the US for almost another 2 years. And then I love mountains, I love skiing. So I was able to get a job in Vail in Colorado at a really good top hotel. And in there, I was then responsible for the entire wine program of this hotel. And having worked there for 5 to 6 outlets, and from everything from an American bar and restaurant to a Swiss chalet-inspired restaurant, so Swiss Austrian cuisine, to a fine dining restaurant, to banquets. We had everything from a $3, Central Valley Chardonnay or Cab to like Petrus and Romane Conti and Austria in addition, obviously, and Switzerland and Germany. So really gave me a massive diversity of wine styles available. Lots of producers came and introduced me to their wines. And, we met a lot of good distributors, importers. And the most important thing, I met my wife there.
Very important. Okay, so 2 more years in the States, and then was that time to come back home?
Yes, so then I have to go back to my Styrian times. And so when I was in Vail in Colorado, we had a really good selection already of wines from Austria. Everyone has their aha moment in his or her wine life when you taste a certain wine and say, oh my God, I can't believe how incredible, intense and structured and complex that wine is. And for me, this was from Steiermark, from the Sattlerhof winery, a 1997 single vineyard Kranachberg Sauvignon Blanc. When I was there in 1998, it just blew my mind. And this was certainly one of the most influential wines to continue the wine route. But we did not have the Sattlerhof wines in Vail in Colorado. So then I called them up. I said, listen, I know a couple of distributors and importers. If you come over, we do something together. We make a small promotion. I think I can set you up with an importer here. So they came over and it worked fine. So they received an importer. Then it was really an idea together, but mainly from Willi Sattler, the owner of the Sattlerhof winery. He said, what are you doing after this? And then he said, I might have an idea. And in the early 2000s, like those medium-sized producers in Austria were receiving more attention on the international market. But it's not like in the US or, in big wine companies around the world where you have a full sales department there, you have to say. So the idea was to join forces, 5 different producers from all different regions in Austria. And he said, you could handle our export business. And then I said, whoa, okay, that sounds really interesting and intriguing, because then I can even get closer to the production side of things. And that idea grew. And so my wife and I decided to go back from Vail. We would have been in La La Land because we also would have received the green card back at that time from the owner of the hotel. But then it was just too early. I was in my mid-20s and I would be stuck in Vail, which is not a bad thing. But from a professional point of view, there would have only been so much more to go up, I think. And so we went back, and it was a very hard time coming back because from La La Land down to rural Austria. But then just a couple months later, the idea with forming that group of growers called Premium Estates of Austria became reality. And we gave each other 2 years to see if it's working or not. And then I left after almost 12 years. So it worked out fine.
Wow, 12 years. So presumably a fair bit of travel ensued in that 12 years as well. What did you find that you were good at in that role? It was presumably doing a lot of different things, but you're already an international person at that stage. You speak a few different languages. You know a lot about wine. Were there any things that you found particularly challenging about that role? Did it come easy to you?
It was a sort of an interesting beginning because it was a role that was newly established in a company that was newly established. So you didn't have any experience from beforehand in a way. And I just tried to work out my best in seeing, what potential markets we could work in and which grape varieties or styles of wines that might be the most interesting. And it appeared quite quickly from an international point of view. The Rieslings and Grüner Veltliners from this area here were the ones that were probably the most interesting globally. And the ones that actually gave me this opportunity from Steiermark, Sauvignon Blancs and Morillons, which are internationally comparable, were certainly in a tougher environment out in these markets. But still, you could really develop this compact box of great Austrian wines in one contact. If you were an importer in a more exotic country for Austrian wines, you had it easier through the company to have only one contact, and we handled the transport arrangements and so forth. So this definitely helped and proved thankfully successful. But you, of course, needed a lot of dedication and time away from home because obviously you need to be out in the market, and then also doing some blendings with the different producers entailed also me traveling to the wineries, definitely on a monthly basis. But it was a huge learning curve. And we didn't have children at that time. My wife was also traveling quite a bit, so it turned out fine.
And just for the listeners, could you just list the producers that were in Premium Estates of Austria, which region they're from, and what their speciality, I suppose, would be?
Absolutely. So Premium Estates of Austria was founded by Sattlerhof, Willi Sattler, who is based down in Gamlitz, close to the Slovenian border in Steiermark, making really outstanding single vineyard-driven Sauvignon Blancs and Morillons, the synonym for Chardonnay. So that's what he largely stands for, and his sons now. And then it was Fred Leumer here in the Kamptal, definitely a name that is recognized in the international market, with especially Grüner Veltliner and Riesling. Pinot Noir, he started also in the Termen region a little bit. We discontinued that project now, but we started together again the sparkling wine business that he first made in 98 and then stopped. But then we refired it up in the 2010s. And Bernhard Heinrich Winery in Burgenland, close to the Neusiedlersee, close to the lake. He's definitely known for Blaufränkisch, Zweigelt, blends of these two. He has single vineyard, Gabarinza and Salzburg were one of the most sought after red wines from Austria. At the beginning, we also had another red wine producer called Josef Pöckl. Pöckl is very close by to the Heinrich Winery, but is stylistically extremely different, very structured, dense, masculine Zweigelt and Zweigelt-based blends. And then we had Fritz Wieninger joining. Wieninger Winery is the pioneer of Viennese wine, basically. Nussberg of Alter field blends, traditional field blends from Vienna. Great Chardonnays, great Pinots from his winery. And to round up the culinary portfolio, we also added artisanal spirits producer called Alois Gölles. Gölles, he's very close by my hometown in Steiermark, and he makes great pure fruit brandies, but also one of the most exciting vinegars. So balsamic apple vinegar, raspberry, apricot, you name it. And of course, pumpkin cider too.
Yeah, and what was the reputation of Austrian wine and how did it change and grow during your time there? So 12-year stints through the sort of early/mid 2000s onwards. What was that trajectory like of fame and awareness of how high the quality of Austrian wine was? And how did that help you, or how did you help that?
I think we had already seen on the international platform wines from Wachau, Kamptal, Kremstal a little bit more than the other regions. Then slowly, they started to look at, they also have some red wines from indigenous varieties like Zweigelt, like Blaufränkisch. And then only really, we have to say lastly, it was Steiermark with Sauvignon Blanc and Morillon, because they also have a price tag that is absolutely valid, but on an international scale, it is expensive in a way. But once we brought the people down to the area and showed them how on the steep hillsides these vines are grown and everything is manual labor and very hard, then they actually understood, and then they also brought the wines in. But I think this was key also in my role in bringing the people to Austria, trying to show them where the wines are born, what the people are like, how the cuisine is important for pairing these wines. And this proved to be really very successful. And I recall in the 2007, 8, 9, we were selling extremely expensive red wines from Austria to the US. Everything was interesting for the people. And even if at that time an Austrian red wine was at around 70, 80 US dollars on the shelf, they would accept it and they would say, okay, I'll try it. I'll check it out. Now that has, of course, changed, but I think over these 2000s, the 2010s, I think Austrian wine has definitely created a nice buzz around the wine community in the world. We have seen that we could be great alternatives to some other fine destinations from around the wine world. And had we not had this at the moment quite challenging economic circumstances, also geopolitical issues close by, I still think we would continue to see an increasing rate just like we had in the 2010s. But given these outside factors, we now have seen, of course, a bit of a slowing of that.
Yeah, well, let's dig in a little bit more to Austria. Obviously, you're a fount of knowledge about all things Austrian. Before we go to the Kamptal to talk more about Bründlmayer, let's go to the area that might be the most familiar to people, the Wachau Valley. Just give us a little rundown, I suppose, of what you see as being the key features of the Wachau.
Well, the Wachau, first of all, is probably one of the most scenic places in wine tourism in Austria and maybe potentially also Europe, because it's just a beautiful valley where the Danube River is flowing through. It's one of the most sort of western located appellations in Austria, because all of our appellations are more in the northeast, east and southeast of the country. But you go from our town here, Langenlois, a little bit further west. So you drive about 15 to 20 minutes and you will end up at the eastern end of the Wachau. Leuben, Oberleuben, Unterleuben, so close by one of our bigger towns, Krems. And the eastern part of the Wachau, in terms of climate, in terms of style of wine, when you don't have big influence by the farmer, I think is a bit more comparable to the wines from the Kamptal, also to some of the wines from the Kremstal area, because the Wachau Valley there broadens, it opens up, it receives maybe also a bit more influence from the eastern side, so the Pannonian influence might still be felt here and there a little bit on the eastern side. But the further you drive west, so you would then arrive in Dürnstein and then further on to Weißenkirchen. Weißenkirchen is basically the heart, the centerpiece of the Wachau. And then eventually down to Wösendorf and Spitz, Joching, but especially Spitz. This is where the cooling influences from the forest district, from the Waldviertel, from the northwest, is influencing the style of the wines more. So the really crisp, fresh components can be felt there in these wines. But it always, of course, has to do with the skill of a winemaker and how he farms, how he practices, because I also think in Leuben, like the producers such as Emmy Knoll, Luki Pickler, Leo Altzinger, they're all in the Leuben area, but they make all of them really very balanced, pure, crisp versions of Wachau wines. While then in Spitz, you have the great Franz Hirzberger, which sometimes has maybe even more voluptuous examples of Spitz, Riesling and Grüner Veltliner, because of their great long-standing philosophy of picking just at a maximum ripeness level, rather late, and these wines can age gracefully and forever. So outspoken wines dominated by this gneiss crystalline bedrock material that you find in the Wachau quite a lot. Really steep terraces that you find there. And then, of course, you also have some riverbeds from the Danube, a little bit more alluvial soil materials on the bottom, where the wines might appear a little bit broader, a little bit creamier in texture. But the Wachau wines have often a lot of flavor intensity, aroma intensity, great structural components, and wines that can age really for an extremely long time, the Rieslings and Grüner Veltliners.
Cool. We'll talk about the varieties in a second, but first I want to look at the Kremstal, which kind of lives in many ways in the shadow of the Wachau, quite literally. But what would you say you need to know about the Kremstal?
Kremstal is definitely largely more löss-driven, so the sandy soil is here a bit more prevalent. Young soil that we also have here, that we have in the Wachau, which was blown down from the Bohemian Massif in the Ice Age. And so a very young fertile soil, very good for Grüner Veltliner. So therefore, the Kremstal wines might appear a bit more sunnier, broader in a way, not losing any way of focus, but they might have a bit more approachability to many people. Let's say consumer friendly. I don't know if that is the right word, but they're definitely very giving wines in a way. But then you should also not forget that on the other side of the Danube River, we still also have a part of the Kremstal. And those wines, for me, have maybe a bit more structure, a bit less body weight, and potentially a bit more finesse than the wines on the Krem side. Although the very western side of the Kremstal, bordering Wachau, vineyards like Pfaffenberg and Steiner Hund and so forth, I mean, they also would bring out really beautiful examples, because they are, in terms of terraces and in terms of exposure, very similar to the eastern side of the Wachau, of the Leuben area. But Kremstal also boasts, a big co-op, Lenz Moser is there, and there's another co-op in the town, Winzer Krems, and then there's their winery, Weingutstadt Krems. So Krems has a huge viticultural history, and I live actually also in the Kremsau. I live in Rondorf, which is a massive wine village in a way. I always say, had we the same average wine consumption in Austria as what we have in our village, and we would have no problem whatsoever to get rid of all of the wine from Austria. And we need to import some of that stuff.
Very good. Again, we are going to hold off going into the Kamptal because I want to look at Grüner Veltliner itself. Because we're growing it now in Australia, you do see more and more every year bottlings of Grüner Veltliner here. Perhaps stylistically, it's only at the beginning of its journey in terms of working out where it could grow, but also how it could grow in which areas, how to express itself differently. You have obviously a lot of different expressions in Austria, in the Wachau alone, of course, the classification system, which has been built around 3 different, I'm not going to say quality levels, really stylistic levels. So just give us again a sense of what Grüner Veltliner can do.
Quite often can actually be sort of a chameleon, and sometimes to a lower involvement consumers, I try to compare it a little bit with Chardonnay at times, and I try to bring examples where you have really light, crisp versions of Petit Chablis or Chablis, and then you have medium-bodied versions where you can have a great village Marceau, but then you can also have massively expressive versions that might have a Napa Valley Chardonnay or a Russian River Valley Chardonnay. Has also this yellower fruit element, what Grüner Veltliner can also bring out. So stylistically, I think Grüner Veltliner is known for a medium-bodied, crisp version with some green citrus, lemon, limey fruit characters, maybe a hint of spice, a hint of pepperiness. That is what maybe most of the people can associate the grape variety with. We do even have lighter examples, like what you mentioned with Steinfeder in the Wachau, for example. Or we have an L&T, a really light, crisp Grüner Veltliner version at 11% alcohol. Very easy to appreciate, I think. But then what I think brought Grüner Veltliner and Austria on the map was actually then also single vineyard expressions from great places like Lamm, like Kellerberg, like Leudenberg, whatsoever. And that has wine, that has complexity, that then might go even into sort of riper green apple, yellow apple, golden delicious element, sometimes even a bit more exotic, so mango, but always has this certain type of smokiness, a spice component. This is clearly a molecule that you find in the grape variety, like with Syrah on the red side. And acidity level is never high. I usually say to the students also. I think Grüner Veltliner is a medium to medium plus acidity level grape. But maybe this spice, pepper component might have an appeal to the people where they say, oh, actually, that's really fresh or refreshing. And obviously, you can pair a lot of great food with, both from an domestic point of view, like classic dishes from here, but also Asian-inspired cuisine, Japanese, etc. And I think that is also what makes the grape variety so interesting.
Yeah, okay, so that kind of dead in the middle of the road there, the kind of Federspiel 12.5-ish% alcohol dry wine. What are the go-to pairings for you with that kind of wine?
So from an Austrian point of view, any type of lake fish, I think, pairs really well. Well, not any type, but especially, I think, trout, salmon trout, pike perch, things like this. But we could go up to a lighter veal dish, chicken, Federspiel type or 12.5 in our world, Kamptal, Terrassen range. I think you could try on a hot day like this, maybe also have our national dish, veal cutlet, breaded Wiener Schnitzel. Up until there, that's fine. And then in terms of vegetarian versions, any type of green vegetables, asparagus, beans, string beans. Artichoke is a very hard vegetable to match with. Grüner Veltliner works really well with that. And then cauliflower. These versions of vegetable types would work well. From an Asian point of view, Japanese is maybe more the sashimi, fine sashimi, sushi side, where you have this delicacy of Grüner Veltliner that usually pairs with the purity of Japanese food really well. And I could see those versions of food pairing fine with Grüner.
Yeah, it is deliciously versatile. It's very good with some of those trickier things, as you say, those sort of more salad green vegetable dishes. but also it's a very fine first wine of the night, palate cleanser, just because it's often quite zippy, crisp, bit crunchy, and a little bit of spice there. It's extremely refreshing and cleansing.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, so terroir expression is always an interesting, sometimes contentious subject. I just want to dig into that a little bit more in Austria and around the Danube Valley. About a third of the vineyard is Grüner Veltliner, more like I think 5% Riesling over there, so it's a completely different size jigsaw piece. I suppose you mentioned in the Wachau the various different rocky profiles of those vineyards. I think it's quite easy for people to start getting a bit hung up on what wines taste like from which soil types or whatever. For me, it's more you've got really dramatic scenery and amazing sights and amazing diversity on those slopes and hillsides. You've got this extraordinary confluence of climatic influences. You have a couple of grape varieties that are pretty good at speaking of where they come from, and therefore they vary really nicely. And the intriguing thing is not trying to work out why or how perhaps, but just really enjoying the diversity of how well Grüner Veltliner and Riesling express really distinct, interesting, specific places in Austria. I don't think I've explained that very well, but what do you think?
So you have your overall topography, the aspect of a vineyard, the proximity to waters. In our case, it's basically only the Kamp River pretty much. Then you have climatic influences, which influence one vineyard more than another. We have two main climatic influences here. On the eastern side of the Kamptal, we still have the Pannonian winds blowing from the east. So therefore, the next days, for example, will be the hottest in the Vienna Burgenland area and Weinviertel, so north of us, because it's largely continental and then also driven still by the Pannonian influence. But then in the normal scenarios, our influence from the northwest is even higher. So the Czech Republic continental climate, so the Bohemian Massif, will bring us then more cooling winds, especially during the night. Those are also influencing factors. Then obviously the altitude of a vineyard, one to another. I always try to explain, I think soil is just one factor. It's obviously a very important factor, but you should take into considerations all these aspects and elements of topography when you decide on what you plant there and where and in which orientation. We do have, of course, when I look at Steinmassel, Riesling, Gneiss, higher altitude, more influence from the northwest, as opposed to Heiligenstein, where you have massive sun exposure and a great aspect, but then maybe a bit more influence already from the east. And of course, you have that in your mind when you taste it and you don't taste it blind. And I guess you feel then the warmer elements and maybe also more density on the Heiligenstein, whereas the purity and balancing more the linear character of a Steinmassel is. So there are those differences, and you can also plant Grüner Veltliner on the rocks in a way, Achleit in the Wachau, or we had it on Loiserberg or on Berg Vogelsang. They bring you maybe then more saline, crisp elements. Will they ever play out the same complexity as Lamm or Spiegel? I'm not sure. I doubt it. But then there are so many people preferring maybe this more saline style of Grüner and not so maybe this Burgundian-driven expression of the grape variety. So many factors up until we put that wine into the bottle that will eventually define what you then can taste on your palate.
Yeah, so just looking at that area of the Danube, then Kremstal, Kamptal, Wachau, just in those particular areas, massive diversity, but huge diversity in structures and flavours in those two grape varieties. So it's an extremely exciting area. You've already mentioned a few of the great vineyards that you work with at Bründlmayer. So you started there, I think, in 2014?
It was actually 16, that's right. But 14 was when Willi asked me to join. Yeah, he gave me enough time to think.
It gave you enough time to get your head around the challenge. So give us a little bit of a history then of Bründlmayer, the reputation as it was when you got there, but even going back further than that, how the beautiful estate that you're working for took shape over time.
So, I mean, there's no doubt that Bründlmayer is one of the biggest names in Austrian viticulture, and that has to do with Willi's father. I think he was certainly the one that gave us the luxury to work some of the greatest vineyards here. He changed the winery in 1947, well, the then farm, into 100% winery in 1947, just after the Second World War. Is when he moved entirely to viticulture. And he grew the recognition, I think, also of the wines from the Kamptal in general. We have bottles here from the 1950s where the labels already state in English, estate bottled. And I think he was already looking for exporting these wines at a time where, no one thought about really bringing the wines outside of Austria. And then really in the early 80s, of course, had to come early, unfortunately, due to the illness of his father. But then came in 1981, with 1982 being a really difficult vintage. So it was not easy, but he already tried and pushed a little bit the quality up. He made a stage at Udellamy in Burgundy at the time, certainly brought some of the practices back there. And then in Austria, the wine scandal happened in the mid-80s, 1985, 86, where, all of the export business, and that was largely still driven by the German market, but all of the export was basically gone to nil. And then thankfully, he had success at Vinitaly at the time in 1986 with his 1985 Chardonnay that won a blind tasting competition organized there. And that was the first really big international fame of the winery. And things like these, and then wineries like Jamek, like Pichler, Knoll, Hirzberger, the Treebaumer in Burgenland and so forth, they brought the reputation back up, thankfully, in those tiring times for Austrian wine. The success really grew and grew. And I think there might have been even some times in here at this winery where it was almost too easy. And I think this at some point could have been felt with the one or the other wine. So then, honestly, for me also personally, at this time, it was like, no, I'm not following the wine so close anymore. But then I recall in 2013 and 14, I recall tasting some of the wines blind, and I thought, okay, so something must have happened here. And indeed it did, because there was a change in the cellar master program. I'm still very good contact with our old cellar master who retired here. And I always bring him for harvest, and we spend a full day tasting and going out to the vineyards. But his philosophy was just a bit differently than what I then felt in the wines. So from 2012, 2013 vintage onwards, it was like almost throughout the entire range, there was more purity, more focus, more precision. And I appreciated that. And then, funnily enough, I got a call from Willi, and we wanted to meet. And so there was a bit of a change here also in terms of demographics. I think in terms of the approach to working in the vineyards in a natural way has always been there. 1979 was the last time when herbicides and pesticides have been used in the vineyards. In his early years, when he had to take over from his father, Willi has maybe one of the very few mishaps when he wanted to already grow in a biodynamic fashion. That was in 1982, and that was a really bad vintage. So he lost a fair amount of his crop at this time. But so our approach in viticulture, and also the way we try to handle things here at the winery in a sustainable way, has been there for a long time. And we just have to make sure that we can continue sort of the legacy of the winery in a way, by also here and there inventing some new things or bringing some new things up, but not losing track and focus. I think our sparkling wine program, for example, in the last 10 years is certainly one that definitely increased in terms of appeal, in terms of complexity, in terms of reserve wines. Things like these are on our minds when we look into the future. And I have to say, unfortunately, also what the consumer likes outside of wine, meaning alcohol-free beverages. We would never make a de-alcoholized wine at the winery in this generation, from the generation Willi Bründlmayer, Vincent, myself, and Edwige, his wife. But with Edwige, ever since my beginning in 2016, we have worked on alternatives to the Coca-Colas of this world. And now we have brought up two things which are actually quite exciting. But it's more difficult than making wine, I always say.
Yeah, right. Speaking of Edwige, I gather that she is a very large champagne fan, which is partly why the Sekt is so important. Sekt has become more important in Austria in general, hasn't it? There's been a new classification of Sekt and an effort on behalf of Austrian wine to lift the quality and also the recognition of the quality of Austrian sparkling wine. Tell me a little bit about what those different wines are that you're dealing with and what proportion of the production sparkling wine is.
Yeah, so as you rightly say, Edwige, hailing from Paris, she missed one beverage that was not close by her anymore when she moved over to Langenlois, so champagne, and we're all big champagne lovers, especially on the grower side in the last 10 plus years or so. But she said we need to try and do something in a similar range. So they started with Brut in 1989, making a first base wine tirage in 1990. And then in 1992, the first version of Willi Bründlmayer came out. Only in 2005 was it when the second sparkling wine was introduced. It was Brut Rosé, which is now the most successful in our winery. And then came 2009 an extra Brut. But ever since I've been here, we've added 4 additional ones. So we have a Blanc de Blanc on vintage. We have Blanc de Noir vintage 16 now. We have a Blanc de Blanc vintage 14. And we have made a Brut Nature in 2017, also on Blanc de Blanc side. So we've been working around this program for quite a bit, and it was very important for me also to increase the reserve wine category, especially for 3 of the existing ones. So Brut now has about 30+% reserve wines already in there. Extra Brut, almost 40%. And then Brut Rosé, we keep it more on the floral fruity side. So it's only 20% of the previous vintage. But still, I think with this, we try to have a continuity of style, of adding complexity. Our Brut at the moment is 4 years on the lease. That is something for an entry-level sparkling wine. And last year, just to showcase also the significance of base wine, we did the assemblage for the tirage 25. Well, the guys actually came to me and said, oh, this is 11.6 alcohol already. So before tirage, and when we make the second fermentation, we would have ended up at 13. It's not in our range. But I said, I actually like the combination of these 2 base wines. So my working title then was Coteau Campenois. And we bottled 1,400 bottles of a base wine. I think it is the first base wine bottled in Austria as being, multi-vintage, red and white breads involved. So you can't claim it anything but Wein aus Österreich, wine from Austria, from a legal point of view. But it just showcases again the increase of importance in the sparkling program, which accounts now for up to 25% of our sales.
Wow. Okay. And before we go into the other wines, we didn't really give Kamptal its day in the sun. What makes Kamptal special? What makes it different from Wachau, Kremstal? What are those things that when you bring people here, you like to point out as being, this is why our wines are shaped this way?
It stretches from the northwestern side that is more similar maybe to like vineyards like Achleiten or the mid part of the Wachau. So gneiss-based, influenced by the northwestern Waldviertel climate from the Czech Republic, and then continues into the very eastern side where it goes to the Wagram, and Wagram is all about less warmer influence from the east already. There you might have a bit more, sunnier expressions of Kamptal wines in Strass, in Kammern, in Zöbing, where Heiligenstein is placed. So we do have these 2 climatic factors meeting basically in the mid portion of the Kamptal. And therefore, I think our wines could be a bit more expressive than some of the cooler parts of Wachau, Spitz, meaning maybe a little bit sunnier in style, maybe a little bit more yellow fruit scented. But once you go up towards the northwestern part, Steinberg, Steinmassel, Loiserberg, you will definitely have saline, crisp, pure elements that we can also associate with the Kamptal. But given the fact that I think 5 of the most renowned producers of sparkling wine in Austria are based in Langenlois, with Leumer, with Schloss Gobelsburg, with Jurcic, with Steininger, with us, and some that might not make it as a really significant portion of their business. But Langenlois has established itself also as the hub of grower sect production in Austria. So that also should tell the consumers and people, yes, we still are moderately cool in a way, even though people would say, are you crazy when we look out today and in this heat wave that we're in at the moment? But still overall, I mean, we've had a January this year, for example, that was for 3 weeks, the entire time below 0 degrees Celsius. So during day and night. So we do still have cool sections of a year. And therefore the wines also appear, I think, balanced. And I often say if we were to hit the pause button now in terms of climate change and climate development, I think we would actually be fine.
Okay, and you've mentioned all the vineyards that I'm about to mention already, but perhaps it gives us a sense of what that difference looks like. Leuseberg and Steinmassel for Grüner Veltliner and Riesling, respectively. As you said, they kind of wouldn't look too out of place over in Spitz in the Wachau in terms of that tension that they have. But yeah, just explain to me what you love about those two particular vineyards and what expression they give.
I think it's first of all the altitude in a way. It's 400 plus meters on Leuseberg. And I think Willi's father was actually the first one to plant vineyards there in the late 70s. And people at this time said, what are you doing? Are you crazy? You can only grow potatoes up there. That's it. And also given the fact that you have really pure gneiss there. The topsoil is very shallow and you have a lot of rocky soil material there. But I love the purity and salinity and more of these sometimes even herbal characters in a cooler year of Grüner Veltliner in there. So they will give us the freshness if we were to, we blend a portion of our monopole side Black Vogelsang into our Kamptal Terrassen Grüner Veltliner. And this definitely gives a bit of this more limey, green citrus, even herbal character to it. And as I mentioned before, and I think we've reached Steinmassel and the one vineyard behind Ried Steinberg, where we have a really big portion of Riesling for Kamptal Terrassen, and then also our single vineyard Chardonnay there, Ried Steinberg. I like, again, this cooling influences from the northwest. The altitude, we are also at around 350 meters. And then again, this rather poor soil type that you find there, the gneiss, which is, for Chardonnay, rather atypical. It's pure crystalline bedrock. Not for Riesling so much. I mean, we have a lot of Riesling in the back there. They give us, again, these brinier elements of Kamptal wines. While you go to Spiegel, between Gobelsburg and Leinenlois, you go to Kammern with Lamm and the bottom parts of Heiligenstein, you definitely have more weight and extract and body that you can expect from the wines deriving from there.
Yeah, so Lamm, you mentioned for Grüner Veltliner, Heiligenstein, obviously very famous Riesling vineyard. Just give them, again, their day in the sun. That Lamm wine is obviously a really important, memorable, distinctive wine, and one that I feel really let express itself in all its fullness. How would you describe, for someone who has never tried the Kammener Lamm Grüner Veltliner, what is that wine all about?
I love the provocacy that really started with this wine in 1986 already. Ever since its maiden vintage, it was done in a Burgundian fashion in a way, because we have to go back again to these rather sad times of Austrian wine in the 1980s and think about most of the people associated Grüner Veltliner with chug wine, liter, double liter, not so much into a higher quality scheme. Apart from, of course, already some exceptions from Hirzberger, Honigvogel, from Jamek and so forth, Knorr, but those were more exceptions than the rule. And so Willi got that success with his Chardonnay at this blind tasting competition. And then he said, okay, this vineyard over there, Lamm, has always given me more the breadth and the warmth and beefed up my Langenlois Grüner Veltliner. I want to dedicate it entirely to a full expression of Lamm and try to make it a little bit similar to what I did with Chardonnay. And so, full batonnage and fermentation in small barrels. And this is what I love about Lamm, is this sort of, provocative way of expressing this is Lamm. This is not Grüner Veltliner. Veltliner is the instrument. And he wanted to showcase the complexity that the variety can give and that this vineyard can give. And we have just tried to continue this path a little bit further. It's made certainly in a different way than in the mid-2000s. But still in terms of élevage and so forth, not very differently. but it just showcases what you can do with a southern exposed site with loamy soil, but with a limestone subsoil and bordering Heiligenstein to give people an idea, okay, this is also Kamptal. This can be a hugely complex wine that might require a bit of time. Like think about, you would not taste now a 24 Premier Cru Puligny Montrachet and say, oh, this is really great. You need to decant it. You need to make sure you give it time, you give it air. When you taste it young, and then you have a great expression of fine white wine from this world.
Yeah, and Heiligenstein?
And Heiligenstein is unique on character with a crystal clear expression of volcanic sandstone material. This is the unique thing about Heiligenstein. We have a volcano there dating back to the Permian period, so 250 to 270 million years ago, where two tectonic plates met in today's Kammern. A volcano erupted and the mountains were really very, very big. And 100 million years later, approximately, the ancient sea, the Tethys and Parathetis, and Vienna was a beach at this time, washed away the huge part of this volcano. All that remained from this time was today's Heiligenstein. And it lends this smokiness, this spice component also to the typical Riesling characters, especially when you age. So let's say after 7 to 9 years, Heiligenstein gets this nice, beautiful, smoky component there. But of course, hugely expressive. Again, more weight and matter than the northwestern locations like Steinmassel, like Steinberg, due to the exposure. I mean, we go back to the 11th century, basically, where this vineyard was mentioned the first time as a source of wine. So the people knew already hundreds and hundreds of years ago that this vineyard might give something special.
So no herbicides since 1979. And certified organic, but a pretty large production that you have. So a lot of oversight over a very fine wine program. How many hectares are you managing these days?
Currently, we're farming 91 hectares.
Right. And as well as the beautiful Sekt, the lovely Riesling and the lovely Grüner Veltliner, red wine is important to you. It was important to Willi as well. What is going on with your red wine program?
Yeah, the red wine program is important in the sense that we just try, when the year permits it, to showcase that Austria's most widely planted red grape, Zweigelt, can also bring out something really interesting, but not more this dark cherry-driven style and maybe full roundness, but more maybe the pure red cherry flavors, more the raspberry side, maybe even a hint of spice that sometimes Zweigelt can bring out from cooler vintages or cooler regions. This is one thing. And the other very important thing is, of course, Pinot Noir. It's, the varieties from Burgundy have been planted here for centuries. When you come to our area, you will see the abbeys of Göttweig. You will see the abbey of Zwettl. So the monks from Burgundy, Cistercian and Benedictine monks, came to our area ever since the 12th century. So they brought these varieties there. And Pinot Noir has always played a big role in our winery, not from a quantitative point of view, but we want to showcase that Kamptal has the potential to bring out fine Pinots. So this is the red wine program, which at this stage is only 15% overall from our entire production. And again, also given the fact that I think red wine consumption at this point in time in Austria, but also I think globally, is not really increasing, but rather stagnant or slightly decreasing. But I think we fare a chance there with those grape varieties like Zweigelt that you can also enjoy on a day like this where it's very hot and you chill it slightly. And it might not be the most complex red that you have had, but it's a very cheerful, enjoyable, sometimes quaffable red wine that you enjoy with a barbecue or something, and you're happy. And Zweigelt we use in a threefold way. The rosé still wine production is still continuing to be very positive. So we do need a lot of rosé from Zweigelt. We make it, of course, base wine for Brut Rosé, so for sparkling, and then in the red wine category. So Zweigelt is versatilely used.
We haven't talked about your Master of Wine, but obviously back in the day, you had an enormously varied wine education throughout your hotel years, and the MW came up in the midst of that. You almost talk about it as though you just sort of picked it up on the way like a souvenir, but obviously it would have taken a lot of work, tremendous achievement. And in a way, it feels like you've got one of the most complete jobs that an MW could wish for. hard work, a lot of land that you're covering with enormously high aspirations of quality and targets that you're hitting in terms of quality every year in a way that I find quite mind-blowing. But how do you describe the skills that you need in your role?
First of all, I think one of the most important is maybe a human aspect, or also, being sort of a troubleshooter. Like, or at this point in time, for example, our vineyard manager is on vacation. I need to make sure I'm in touch with the guys out in the vineyards, and that at this point in time is not very easy because it is really hot out there. And so you need to motivate them to tend and farm vine by vine in a way that we'd like it to be. And then you talk to the mechanic and see what the problems are currently in terms of our tractors and see what we can do there. And then it's going to the bookkeeper and looking quickly in the morning in terms of, are there some delicate issues in terms of payment that are not maybe coming in. We have a staff of now 50, and I think it's also important to play there as humanly as possible, aside from all the really important viticulture, winemaking, sales sort of things. So I think it's more a human managerial side that is key in this role than having, for example, the best knowledge of, how do I make this wine specifically in that way. I think we have a great team in general that has a lot of knowledge. And as you rightly say, I think I see myself as basically going through the MW program in reality, because what you need to do in the MW exam and in your studies is having a really fair bit of idea of viticulture. You need to know what's going on in the cellar, how wine generally is being made, and what you can do to bring the best possible result into the bottle. You need to look at the quality assurance and quality control aspects of things, and making sure the wine is going into the bottle in a safe environment. And then you, of course, also need to look at the commercial point of view, because we can only do the things we do if the bottle is sold and is being consumed. We need the turnover very, very clearly. So you need to have an economic point of view. And then at the same time, what is currently relevant in our wine industry and wine business. And I have already been invited 2 or 3 times to talk about alcohol-free versions of wine or beverages. There, I always say I wish I could talk a bit more about Lamm and Heiligenstein and Spiegel. But currently we see that there is a trend also towards other products and beverages, and we have to follow suit in order to maintain our business sustainably and successfully. And that's also great that, an influence came from Edwige. She did a late study. She never mentioned it, but she did a master's degree just about 10 years ago and found student buddies who were substantially younger than her. And she looked at what they were drinking, during the study. And so she came up with the idea very early on, what could we do low in calories, but with flavor, and hopefully organically, vegan, sustainably produced. And here we are now today, and I have to make sure we have enough alcohol-free, great alternatives around. I would never have thought about this when I studied the Master of Wine program, for example, On the one hand, that's the beauty because it never gets boring. On the other hand, of course, I wish, and I'm also convinced that in the long run, this great beverage will always survive. It has survived 8,000 years and it tells a great story, but we probably need more avid listeners and consumers, avid listeners to your podcasts, to people who have time and also the will to learn about these things. In the young generation, we have 3 children, and I think in some of the young generations, the patience for studying and learning different things is not given so much anymore due to the huge different influences from media, from elsewhere. And so my hope and belief is that we also make the wine accessible to people that might not have so much time. So that's probably our task in the near future as well, to make it easy and understandable for them.
Yeah, you talk about that as an educational thing, but I suppose there's also the aspect that, you work with Willi, who I'm sure has been a really interesting influence upon you, and Edwige, as you say, sophisticated Parisian who has also had an influence there. There's a real culture here too of ideas and of provenance, but also it's not all highbrow. A lot of this has come naturally to you, right? You were interested in this because you got in conversations with your brother and with your best friend, and it wasn't about education or detail so much as just it was an interesting space to be around. And that for you, as you said earlier, it wasn't wine about wine, it was wine about places. And I just wonder sometimes how much of this is just what people see and what they hear about wine is not quite what wine can be. I think a little bit of that message just gets lost because perhaps the alternative that wine can be to people is not expressed as a cultural element of their life.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It has to be looked at it that way. It tells a lot of stories of places, and that entails this one beverage, but many things and aspects are involved around it and interwoven with wine. And I hope that there is still remaining interest of wine seen as not only a beverage, but as a historical and cultural and also contemporary element in lives of people. And I think this could happen. And we see it that wine has united people, and wine is also sometimes an element to bring people together again if they probably fought or if they were not happy with each other. So we should also not forget the social aspect of this beverage.
Yeah, and for you, of course, it's taken you a long way. I mean, you're not too far away from where you started, from Steiermark to Kamptal, but you kind of have been around the world. You're looking extremely healthy and youthful, I have to say, for someone who works so hard. But, how would you sum up what wine has done for you so far, or what kind of life wine has given you?
Wine is my job, but it's also a passion and a living element in me. And I think what wine has given me most of, apart from education and learning about different things from around the world, it has given me so many great friendships, not only along the way of the MW program, but along my job in the last 20 plus years. I have met so many great people, and really, really, very, very rarely a person where I would say I'd like not to meet this person anymore. This hardly happens in our industry. And that's a great thing, because it's not like a 9-to-5 job where you say, okay, I'm looking forward to 5 p.m. because then, job is over. No. It entails all things around our lives, and friendships have been given to me through that beverage. I think that's one of the most positive aspects in this world of wine.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack, that's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for additional editing, and to my guest, Andreas Wickhoff MW. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!